Napoleon Bonaparte, born in then Italian Corsica in 1769, was the dominant personality of his time. He died in exile on the lonely British South Atlantic island of St. Helena in 1821. But though he was a shell of his former self, living in isolation in the middle of nowhere, his life cast a long shadow, and his influence continued for decades after his death. His military philosophy and tactics are still taught throughout the world, for though the weapons of today are much different than those used by his armies, the tactics he used on the battlefield are timeless. Speed, audacity, and surprise being foremost among them. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most fascinating men in history. If this introduction to the darker side of Napoleon interests you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Vive la France! Napoleon became Emperor of France in 1804, though he had been the country's de facto ruler since 1799. For anyone to become emperor after the French Revolution of 1789 and the years immediately after had been unthinkable. The revolution took place to rid France of a king and a system of privilege and oppression. That revolution cost a lot of blood and treasure and caused years of struggle and chaos in France. When Napoleon was ready to take power, the French were tired of political violence and upheaval, high prices, food shortages, and corrupt government. Napoleon, like Caesar more than 1800 years before him, promised law, order, and economic stability. For the first years of his reign, Napoleon managed to do just that. Bring a sense of stability. He also brought France military glory. He rose to fame in the 1790s through his prowess on the battlefield. He helped to bring the ideals of the French Revolution to many parts of Europe. Unfortunately for France and Napoleon, his eyes were bigger than his stomach, and he bit off more than he could chew, making enemies of Great Britain and Russia. His invasion of Russia in 1812 was a disaster, and the emperor and what was left of his army marched back to France, leaving tens of thousands of dead men behind them. Exiled on the island of Elba in the Mediterranean in 1814, he then launched one of the most remarkable comebacks in history, escaping the island, landing in France, rallying hundreds of thousands of men to him, and taking power once again. Then, leading his armies to face a coalition of European powers, he was defeated at the famous Battle of Waterloo in Belgium in 1815. In July 1793, France was still a divided country in many ways, despite overthrowing and executing King Louis XVI in January of that year. As a result, Napoleon found himself siding, to a degree, with the more radical revolutionaries led by Maximilien Robespierre. At the time, informational pamphlets were all the rage, the social media of the revolution, and Napoleon, an army officer, published one which garnered the support of Robespierre's brother. This led to promotion for Bonaparte and his appointment as the artillery commander at the southern city of Toulon. For reasons rooted deeply in history, and over the worry that anti-royal revolutionary ideas might spread from France to England, the two countries found themselves at war. The English had seized the critical French port of Toulon on the Mediterranean coast and were still there when Napoleon took command of the artillery. Napoleon soon devised a plan to oust the British from Toulon, and in December, he was wounded in the attack which drove the British out. This was the beginning of Napoleon's rise to fame. He then was sent to help in a war against two other enemies of France, Austria and Sardinia, now a part of Italy, then an independent kingdom. Though a young officer, his plans for the campaign led the French to victory in 1794. After a tumultuous year that saw his career prospects fall and rise due to political intrigue, Napoleon found himself in Paris on October 3, 1795, when an anti-government riot took place. 3 years before, Bonaparte had watched a savage riot take place in Paris and had promised himself that should he ever be in a position to prevent something like that from happening again, he would. Given command of outnumbered government forces at the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris, Napoleon, and an officer named Joachim Murat, who would soon be one of Napoleon's most famous generals, stood by cannon as a massive and extremely hostile crowd approached. Napoleon ordered Murat, a fellow artillery officer, to give them a whiff of grape shot, and the cannon opened fire. Grape shot is two smaller-sized cannonballs attached by a chain. Hundreds of cannonballs were fired at the incoming crowd in massed cannons under Napoleon's command. Not only do the cannonballs do great damage, but the chains that hold them together act like a giant razor. They cut through the crowd, taking off heads and limbs, cutting people in half, etc. 1,400 people are said to have died. This quickly ended the riot, and Napoleon was again acclaimed as a hero. After the overthrow of the king, the revolutionary First French Republic outlawed slavery in France and its overseas possessions, many of which were in the Caribbean. During the early part of the revolution, Napoleon supported many of its ideas. Still, when he rose to power, he abolished abolition. He reinstated slavery and sent troops to the French colonies in the Americas to restart it. As you might guess, the formerly enslaved population was not eager to return to that life and rose against the French. The campaign was marked by much brutality on both sides, though it's quite a bit more understandable for those wanting to remain free. The history books record mass killings by French troops. Still, in 2005, French author and filmmaker Claude Ribot published a book entitled Napoleon's Crimes, in which he asserted that French troops sealed rebels in the hulls of ships and burnt sulfur in the lower decks, creating lethal gas. History's first mass killing in gas chambers. Napoleon supposedly approved this. Ribot's assertions are still being debated within French history and sociological circles. Still, if true, it shines an entirely new light on the emperor, whose military genius has made him the idol of millions, including Winston Churchill. Napoleon was popular with most French men and women almost until the end of his reign as emperor. In 1800, France was the most populous country in Europe, home to nearly 30 million people. Majority means over 50%, and though Bonaparte was the favorite of more than 50% of the French, that still left many people indifferent towards him, disliked him, or hated him vehemently. Napoleon did a lot of good for the French. He began the excellent public education system and built roads, dams, and bridges. A large chunk of the population became wealthier. However, much of this wealth was taken from conquered lands, and Napoleon dominated or controlled most of Europe by the time of his campaign against Russia in 1812. He also laid down the foundation of the modern French legal system. He passed new laws and codified the entire nation's laws in what is still called the Napoleonic system. He created this to protect many of the rights won in the French Revolution. And, though he repealed legislation giving women and non-propertied men the right to vote, many laws preventing abuse by tax collectors and landlords remained. Freedom of religion was guaranteed, and Napoleon tried to heal the damage between the Catholic Church and the French government that was a product of the Revolution. But, though freedom of speech, the press, and assembly were codified into law, they were not particularly respected by Napoleon, his secret police, or the system of government informers that existed throughout the country. In many ways, like Putin's Russia, people could make money in almost any way they wanted, unless they stepped on the toes of someone more powerful. But there was an invisible line more people dared not cross, criticizing the emperor, his policies, or his government. While many people in France, especially his soldiers, loved him, millions did not. There was never any real active resistance movement against Napoleon in France, not on any large scale, but there were people who were willing to put their lives on the line to get rid of him, for they saw him as the betrayer of the revolution. France had bled to get rid of a system that favored the upper classes, only to end up with an emperor who created a new aristocracy which was seen by many as just as bad as the early system, often called the ancien régime, the ancient regime. Many people believed Napoleon's system to be worse in a way. not only for the never-ending wars, but because of the hypocrisy of many of the leading members of French society under Napoleon. These people, turned into dukes, princes, etc. by Napoleon, frequently used the rhetoric of the revolution to defend what they were doing in France and overseas, when the reality was the exact opposite. There were many assassination attempts or plots against Napoleon. Obviously, all failed. These came from both sides of the political fence, the radicals on the left and right-wing monarchists who wanted to restore the ancien regime and get rid of the impostor. Two of these attempts happened in 1800 within 2 months of each other in October and December. The first one, put together by supporters of the revolution, was a relatively straightforward plot to attack Napoleon as he came out of the Paris Opera House. The plotters would rush and stab him to death, as Brutus did to Caesar. This was the Conspiration de Poignard, or the dagger plot. The plot was discovered by the police early and allowed to continue so that the police could find all of those involved. 4 plotters were sentenced to death and sent to the guillotine shortly after that. The second plot of 1800 is more famous. This is called the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, for the street where explosives were laid in the hope that they would kill Napoleon when he passed by to attend the opera on yet another occasion. Yes, Napoleon loved the opera, and his public appearances there were the only times that many Frenchmen and women got to see him. This plot is more famously known as the plot of the Infernal Machine, or simply the Machine Infernale attempt. On Christmas Eve 1800, assassins pulled a cart loaded with explosives to a place on the Rue Saint-Nicaise where they believed the consul would pass by. The original Infernal Machine had been a barrel stuffed with iron rods, nails, and other bits of metal used by the rebels during the Spanish occupation of Holland. Dutch insurgents would set it off from a distance by pulling a string some distance away, which set off a shotgun blast and set off the device. The plotters who attempted to kill Napoleon made a similar device, but instead of a regular barrel, they used a huge wine cask. 10 days before the date of the attempt, they fastened the keg to a wagon and filled it with gunpowder, nails, etc. Lookouts told of Napoleon's approach, and as his coach raced by, the conspirators tugged the string that pulled the trigger and set off a massive blast. One of those killed was a 14-year-old girl that the plotters had paid to hold the horse and cart still while they waited. 4 other people were killed and 26 others wounded, some severely. Napoleon's driver had had too much to drink that evening and was driving fast on the Paris streets. That saved Napoleon, who was well past the device when it went off. After investigation, he believed that he was not only saved by his intoxicated driver, but by the fact that the plotters had used inferior gunpowder, which caused a delay. Following Napoleon in another carriage were his wife Josephine, Napoleon's sister Caroline, and Josephine's daughter Hortense. They followed behind Napoleon's coach at some distance and were on the other side of the device when it exploded. Though no one was gravely injured, Josephine passed out and Hortense suffered a cut on her hand. Caroline was pregnant, and while she was uninjured, she became anxious and mentally unstable for a time after the attempt. Her husband was the man who had helped Napoleon put down the riot outside the Tuileries Palace some years before. Both he, Napoleon, and Caroline blamed the blast for their son's epilepsy, as all their later children were born healthy. Napoleon was in a rage afterward, even though he calmly attended the opera for a time to show the public that he was still alive. Though the plotters were all royalists hoping to restore the ancien regime, Napoleon instructed his infamous police chief, Fouché, to blame radical revolutionaries in order to clamp down on what Bonaparte believed to be the biggest threat to his rule. 130 leading radicals were rounded up and forcibly exiled from France. The 2 actual ringleaders escaped to England. One returned after the fall of Napoleon to great glory and was made a Marshal of France by the restored monarchy. 4 others were executed, 2 barely having a role in the plot. There were plots on Napoleon's life after the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise, but it was this attempt that really shook him. After this episode, Napoleon became increasingly paranoid. Not to Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler levels, but he was a different person after the blast than he was before. After the Infernal Machine plot, Napoleon cracked down hard on any dissent, building a secret police apparatus that regularly employed torture on those suspected to be in opposition to l'Empereur. Despite his darker and egomaniacal side, Napoleon's constant victories on the battlefield and his subjugation of virtually every country in Europe made him extremely popular in France. Even today, Napoleon's tomb is still one of the most honored and visited places in Paris, with over 1 million visitors yearly. If you liked our video about Napoleon's dark side, you'd love our other content too. Please like and subscribe to our channel for more.